Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the GIC online session for health, safety, and security. We're just going to wait a couple minutes while folks have a chance to log in, and we'll begin in just a few minutes. Thank you.
And thank you all for coming as we wait to get started.
Hi, folks. Welcome to our session on health, safety, and security. For those of you who have just joined us, I'm just going to give you one more minute for any stragglers that are having any issues logging on, and then we'll start our session. Thank you. Okay, for the sake of time, I think we're going to start our session. So I just want to say welcome to everyone who are joining us today. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. My name is Matt Byrnes. I am the director of the Global Internship Conference and also the CIEE Study Abroad Conference. Welcome to the GIC online session, Health, Safety, and Security, Internships in a Pandemic and Post-Pandemic World. We obviously regret that we're not meeting in person in Vancouver, Canada, as we had planned, but we are so honored that so many of you have joined us today. Over 900 of you have registered for the session, and you represent over 30 countries internationally. In preparing our panel, our panelists asked what sort of people will be tuning in and who have attended the GIC, and I said, a view of the audience, you're the greatest people in the world, and I truly mean it. I'm continued to be amazed by your passion and your dedication that you show to your students, particularly in these challenging times. So I hope you get a lot out of this session. When we canceled the in-person conference in Vancouver, we committed to having practical, free online sessions for the benefit of the field. And so we reached out to you to ask what sort of topics that you're interested in hearing. And overwhelmingly, we heard two themes. One was on virtual internships, which is what we covered yesterday. For those of you who have missed the session, we have recorded that session and we'll be posting it to our website, globalinternshipconference.org, later today. And then today's session is on health, safety, and security. And we turned to three individuals with a lot of experience in the industry, and they have advised universities, governments, NGOs, educational organization on many aspects of student wellness throughout the years. We have a panel of three individuals, Bill Bull, Bill Frederick, and Colin McElroy. And just let me tell you a little bit about each of them. So Bill Bull is the Vice President of Risk Management at CIEE. Prior to that, he was the Vice President of Program Management, overseeing study abroad programming quality for nearly 200 programs in over 40 countries around the globe. Prior to joining CIEE, Bill most recently served as East Africa, East Indian Ocean Safety and Security Officer for the Peace Corps, an organization that he's been involved with since 1985. Bill's Peace Corps postings included responsibilities in Gabon, Liberia, and Madagascar. For his work in Madagascar, Bill won the John F. Kennedy Award and a knighthood from the Malagasy government. Bill holds a bachelor's degree in international affairs from Lafayette College and a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Our second panelist is Bill Frederick, who's the founder of Lodestone Safety International, specialized in health, safety, and security for educational service organizations operating abroad. Previously, he was the director of safety at SFS and an instructor program director for Outward Bound for 16 years. He is a faculty committee member for Wilderness Medical Associates International. He also holds a master's degree of education from Harvard University and a CTH from ISTM. Our third panelist is Colin McElroy, who's the Director of Health, Safety, and Security at CIEE. Prior to joining CIEE, Colin was with the Army, the US Army, for over 10 years and departed as a major specializing in military police and foreign affairs. While in the Army, Colin spent numerous years working and living abroad, including serving 2 deployments in Iraq. Colin holds an associate's degree in Arabic, a Bachelor of Arts degree in History, a Master of Science in International Relations, as well as a Master of Arts in Business and Organizational Security Management. I also wanted to mention that there are 2 other individuals involved with this call. They are my colleagues, Alison Geltema, who will be handling the question and answer part of our program, and Patrick Rankins, who has been working on the back end, setting everything up from an IT perspective. If you have any questions throughout the session, please type them into the chat box, and Allison will curate as many questions as we can at the end of the session, and our panel will answer them as best as they can. And furthermore, we're recording this session, and we will also be posting it live to our website either later today or early tomorrow morning. So without further ado, I thank our panel, and I'm going to throw it over to Bill Bull. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Kind of you to give us such nice introductions, and thank you one and all for coming to this. Wanted to briefly talk about what the goals of this are, what we hope we're going to be accomplishing today. We thought we would start off with Bill Frederick talking to us to sort of taking a pulse of what's going on in the field today and more information around the COVID virus than you ever really wanted to know. Then we'll kick it over to me, and I'm going to talk about this on a sort of the macro level, 40,000 foot view of sort of risk, and this is a risk event, and what are the big level concerns you might want to start paying attention to as we work towards a return to having participants go do internships and study and work abroad. And then Colin's going to wrap us up with, if the macro version is going to look at the global considerations and the countrywide considerations, Colin's going to get down into the micro level operational considerations that are at play as we enter this brave new COVID world. So that's what we're doing. This slide goes through that. For kicks and giggles, I threw on here. We did a presentation about NCOVE, as it was called back in January, to all of our staff inside CIEE. And this graphic there is what the distribution was like back in the end of January, on the 30th of January, and when we were concerned and we were considering withdrawing students out of Shanghai and internships out of all of China. And it's sort of remarkable looking at that number and go, yeah, the world's a very different place now. So I'm going to turn it over to Bill to start talking about what the world is now, and we'll work through the slides. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks very much, Bill. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. As Matt said, what I do, what my business does is health, safety, security for service and educational groups that are sending students to countries not their own. And I'm also on some safety committees and boards for some experiential ed and adventure education organizations that operate overseas. And I was invited into some of the deliberations for some sail training organizations that work overseas. So I've been at the table for a lot of discussions about what do we need to consider to operate in a pandemic and post-pandemic world. And up until about 3 weeks ago, oh, not yet, Bill. Up until about 3 weeks ago, the conversations across these very different organizations were pretty similar. Everybody would talk about what they think they understood about COVID-19. We talk about travel challenges of open borders, available flights, quarantines, visas, all that. And then we start talking about risk reduction protocols. Whose protocols would we follow? What was the practicality of trying to follow protocols in some of the programs? And at some point in the conversation, the realization would settle in that no matter which protocols we chose, and no matter how great the compliance with those protocols were, we realized we really couldn't reduce the risk of a student or getting COVID-19 in the presence of somebody else that had COVID-19, whether they were symptomatic, asymptomatic, asymptomatic. And the conversation would start to go into organizational survival or whatever. But in the past 3 weeks, the conversations have become a lot more hopeful and interesting as we're getting more into problem solving. And the reason for that is, I think, these 4 points. Next slide, please. The first point is that COVID-19 is likely to be with us for a very long time. It may just be a year, it may just be 2 years. We'll talk about vaccines and herd immunity later on, but it may very well be with us for a lot longer than that. The second point is that there's no set of operationally reliable practices yet that will confidently reduce the risk of getting COVID-19 in the presence of a carrier. And those were the things that we thought we knew before. The third realization was that there are potential participants, people who are reading, seeing, hearing the same news, the same data, the same research that we're all hearing, who understand the risks and they want to participate in international programs. They want to go on internships. And then certainly international programs would like to conduct their programs. And so if everybody understands the risk and everybody still wants to move forward, then maybe we should start to figure out how to move forward. But understand that this is a very different proposition than we've done before. Usually if there is a risk that we don't feel like we can reduce adequately, we change the program around to get the risk out of there. In this case, what we're talking about is operating with a very known risk. And the key to all this is going to be about really good communications, really good clarity, really good transparency, and a really clear understanding that we are sharing that risk. Next slide, please. There has been shall we say, a lack of unity among the authoritative voices, both internationally and nationally, around COVID-19, which has made things perhaps more confusing than they need to be. There is no single entity that everybody agrees with and accepts. And some international entities have tried to do a good job and it's all become very political. Some national entities have done a very good job preparing their citizens and taking pretty aggressive steps. And some of those countries are now emerging from the pandemic, at least for now, whereas some countries have not. So some authorities have mostly offered denial, conspiracy theories, and quack medicine. But next slide, please. We should all be really clear that despite all of that, there has been a steady, methodical, plodding march of data gathering and research sharing internationally, so that we are slowly but inexorably uncovering facts. Next slide, please. Once we understand what is the case, once we understand facts about what's important, what's not important, we can start to think strategically about how to make this a return to operation, an operation in a pandemic, a more reasonable proposition. Next slide, please. One of the most important facts that has come out in the last couple of weeks is the primacy of shared airspace, airflow, and ventilation. We spent a lot of time thinking about how long viruses survive on the surfaces of hard surfaces, soft surfaces, et cetera, et cetera. And just a couple of weeks ago, the CDC came out to say that it's actually very difficult to transfer the virus or to contract the virus just from surface contact. And really what it's about is shared airspace. When the virus first was in the news in December, we were initially hearing that it was not person-to-person, spreading person-to-person. And then we were hearing it was spreading person-to-person through coughing and sneezing. And now we're hearing that it's spreading through speaking and through singing. The diagram on the upper right is a pretty well-known event where the person in red, or the square that is red, represents the person that had COVID-19 during a choir practice. And at the end of a 2 or 3 hour choir practice, all the people in yellow were infected with COVID-19. And the squares that are white represent those that were not infected with COVID-19. The diagram on the lower left is a Japanese restaurant. You can see the 4 arrows pointing from right to left. That was the air conditioning, and that's the airflow. And you can see that the tables adjacent to the person that had the disease, that had COVID-19, who were in the airflow, got the disease, and those who were sitting at tables that were perpendicular to the airflow did not get the disease. And then if you look on the lower right diagram, that is a call center in Korea. It's a 17-story building. There was one infected person who was going in and out of that building every day, touching elevator buttons, presumably touching other things, et cetera. And no one in the building got infected with COVID-19 except for those in the same floor, in the same working space that the infected person was working in. And presumably, I don't know where in the diagram this person's workstation was, but presumably where the most blue is where they were. Next slide, please. So then we also have the things that we know we don't know yet. And there's been a lot of talk about future waves. The Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy out of the University of Minnesota has posited 3 scenarios. The first scenario is the one that the WHO had just warned us about last week, which was that countries that were opening up prematurely are very likely to have recurring waves, maybe by the end of June or into July. The second scenario is the one we've heard the most about, and that's mostly based on the flu pandemic of 1918, where the spring infections were fairly serious, but nothing compared to the fall. Around October, November, the virus had mutated and came around again, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of deaths right now. They were talking about tens of millions of deaths back then. The third scenario is probably the most likely. One of the things that makes the second scenario unlikely is that the viruses are very different. Coronaviruses don't tend to mutate that quickly. And we're not in the middle of World War I with troop ships that were serving as incubators, aren't moving lots of people back and forth. And there is data out of Italy from the other day. 2 doctors, independent of each other, believe that they are seeing a second wave of disease in Italy. And what they are saying is that it is significantly less deadly and less viral than the first wave. Second issue is we are realizing now that yes, the illness, people that have recovered from the illness do have some immunity. The more ill that somebody has been, the more robust the antibodies appear to be. However, people that weren't very ill don't have too many antibodies, and we're not sure how long those antibodies are going to last. Coronaviruses are not known for creating a robust immune response, and if the disease itself is not creating a great immune response, then the likelihood of a traditional type vaccine being developed is not very high. If the disease agent doesn't afford immunity, then giving a attenuated version of it probably is going to have less effect. But there is some stuff going on with gene therapies and a few other things. So maybe there will be a vaccine, but understand that the fastest vaccine that's ever been developed, which was for mumps, took 4 years, and dengue fever that's been around for 87 years, and HIV that's been around for 30 years still don't have vaccines despite a lot of effort. And then again, if the disease does not create a very robust immune effect, then herd immunity probably isn't going to be a big factor. If you're only immune for a year, that means that every 2 years you could certainly get it. Next slide, please. So most international education organizations look to authorities to help us make our destination go and no-go decisions. And in the United States, that's the Centers for Disease Control, but there are a lot of organizations worldwide, and most countries have their own, and if not, they either follow the CDC or they follow the World Health Organization. Next. We also look to our government's travel advisories for our direction, our no-go decisions. And as the disease was spreading last March, people were looking to the CDC and the US Department of State to give an indication that it was time to suspend programs. And neither organization changed their travel notices or the travel advisories until it was a little bit too late. A number of students and interns got stranded overseas, and there are reports of quite a few people getting COVID-19. And one of the things that we're taking away from that is that both of those organizations have a lot of different constituents, some with very differing agendas than study abroad or international internships. And that while we should still use both of those organizations for significant data points, and we certainly shouldn't be exceeding their recommendations unless we have a very good justification for doing so, what we're realizing is that we need to get much better at information acquisition, and we need to create a much better capacity for analyzing that data so that we can make more conservative choices when that's appropriate. Next slide, please. To wrap up my end of this, the COVID-19 was certainly by far the most disruptive event of the past year, but it wasn't the only disruptive event. We've had emerging diseases, tropical cyclones, wildfires, protests, etc. For years. They're not unfamiliar hazards, but within the past year, we've seen those events in a much greater magnitude than we've ever seen before. And looking ahead, it would be a reasonable expectation, given climate change and the world political situation, that we will be seeing more disruptive events, and COVID-19 is going to be with us for a while to come. So the organizations that are going to survive and thrive in this brave new world are those that can innovate and adapt and which have sufficient resilience to be able to respond to events as they're going on. Part of that's going to be about renegotiating our relationships with our participants, our interns, our students, our sending schools, our providers, our vendors, our insurance companies, et cetera, so that everybody understands exactly which share of the risk is theirs. And again, as I said earlier, communication, clarity, transparency, and shared risk are going to be the key to this. It may sound in some ways daunting, but in some ways we've all been innovating and adapting for the last 30 years and adapting to the evolution of information and communication technology. And we will innovate and adapt to this. It'll be a little bit steeper learning curve, but not a qualitative difference. Thanks very much, and I'll turn it back over to Bill.
Great, thank you, Bill. And I'm going to pick up where you dropped the ball for me there to keep moving us forward. As you start looking at some of the, again, we did a global level review of COVID itself and the disease itself. Let's start talking deeper about some of the more specifics, as you know, this is a risk management event that we should be talking about. And I thought, though, since while we work in the risk management field, it was worth the moment's digression to make sure we understand what we're saying when we talk about risk in the risk management field. That risk is a value that we can understand. Even if we don't understand it perfectly, we can understand it imperfectly. And risk is defined as sort of the impact times the probability, or the likelihood times what's going to happen with it. And of course, this happens over time. So all events that you consider, you want to consider this from essentially a likelihood and impact event. And whether you look at a chart like this, and we're not doing a session on risk and what is risk. We could at some point, but you want to consider the likelihood of something happening, or the impact if it does. Examples of this would be something like airplane travel. Well, the probability of an airplane crash is actually quite small. However, the impact of an airplane crash, if you're on that crash, is pretty critical event, a fairly very severe. And other events are, when we start looking, we do a lot of data collection at CIEE around what happens to students, and we've discovered that the number one crime that occurs to a student is pickpocketing. It's pretty likely, but the impact is relatively negligible or minor. And when you start talking about how you want to manage risk, you start looking about which of these can you have an impact on. Can you perhaps work on lessening the impact if it does occur, if a risk event does occur, or can you impact the probability or the likelihood of it occurring? And that's where you want to spend your energy, is where you need to sort of start thinking about what is the risk that you're trying to manage, how likely is it, can you reduce the likelihood, can you also and simultaneously reduce the severity of the impact? Can you make sure if it does occur that you can manage that in a way that isn't so bad, or at least not as bad? Because as Bill pointed out, the assumption is this is endemic, this is present everywhere, it's going to be with us for a while. So what can we do to reduce the likelihood of it occurring for our students, and or our interns, and what can we do to reduce, if they do catch it, make sure that we are ready to support them. We want to get really crazy about this. If your internships are placed solely in emergency rooms, perhaps you might want to consider reducing the likelihood by changing the location of the internship site. In terms of how to reduce the impact, you want to make sure that you can either mitigate the likelihood of getting it, or your ability to provide quality care. But I thought we would do a quick thought experiment here, as we've all been thinking about this event. We've all been thinking about COVID and is it going to happen? And we want to, part of risk management is you go in eyes open to, it's a known risk, it's there. Let's understand as many of the edges as we can. Let's work on as much as we can, and then start making our plans from there. You don't hide from it. We all have learned that putting your head in the sand doesn't mean you're not going to get bit in the butt. Sorry for that bad analogy. Things just flow sometimes. But I thought what we might want to do is use the technology of a Zoom and do a quick poll of us all of, we're going to run a Zoom poll. You're going to get a question in a moment, and you're going to answer this question of, for you, as you think about this and the locations where you're working and the types of internships and the type of experiences you're providing, how do you assess the intersection of probability or likelihood and the impact of COVID-19 disrupting your program if you run, this makes the assumptions you're going to run programs, but we sort of reduce that scale for the Zoom system to make it, a couple choices. Is it very likely and negligible? Is it very unlikely and critical? How are you thinking about this? So Patrick, who's assisting us, is going to launch a Zoom poll now. You're going to pick one of these 9 things and you're going to vote. And we're going to take a look at what we all feel and think about it based on this set of criteria. So how are you thinking it is in your location and the types of internships you do? So take a moment. Everyone pick one of those slots of very likely to negligible to very unlikely and critical, or somewhere in the middle. You can put your finger on the color and then go left and right and figure out what one that is. And what I don't know is when the poll is done. We'll take 12 more seconds, then we'll end the polling. And we will show the poll results for all of us to see what this group of 360 people think about the likelihood and impact of COVID-19 disrupting you this fall. And it's perceptual, so it's your best guess. All right, Patrick, do you want to show the results so we all can see? Okay, let's take a moment here to quick look at this. Of course, we could prepare what this was going to show us, but it seems like 30% of people say it's likely, and the impact is be moderate for the types of things you do. For those of you who have it very likely and critical is the next highest is very likely and moderate, followed by very likely and critical. And then we start going down. We don't have no one has it very unlikely and negligible, which is interesting. So we did this mostly, there are no right answers here, but as you start thinking through your thoughts of, you've identified that this is likely or very likely. In fact, I would say we could add all these things up between likely and very unlikely seems very small for the most part. But as we look through operational considerations of getting there, where you think about what this is how you can start to think about how you can impact either the likelihood or the impact if it does occur. So I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is going to go there on a macro level, the concept of, however you consider the likelihood or not likelihood of, let's go very big. Let's go, take the lens all the way back. Should you and can you be there? Can you have these same types of things you've been doing in this COVID world? I'm working hard not to say post-COVID because we are not post-COVID. We are COVID. COVID is us right now. We've got COVID. It's on our horizon, and it's on our horizon for the foreseeable future. Risk managers don't plan for the moonshot of a cure that comes through and makes it all go away, because that's planning to fail. Failure to plan is planning to fail. So we're planning it's going to be there because it's easier to back away from this if it's not there. So if you're thinking about can you or should you be there, how are you tracking the presence, and do you have a systematic way of going about doing this? How are you tracking your information on the public health capacity to ensure from a mitigation standpoint that if it does appear, that the public health system where you are is going to be able to support you and your students and your internships in an outbreak? What is the role of testing? Can you make sure it's there? And if a participant is scared, nervous, worried, or believe they've been exposed, can they get testing? Certainly when all this broke out, we had a number of our students around the world that were, some of them got a test done, but they couldn't get the test results back. And basically they isolated for 14 days, then flew home because they had no idea if they ever had it or not. They just had to assume they did. One of the things that also consider is the ethical considerations on your host community if you're bringing strangers in. I've been working a lot with our teams around the world of this concept of right now, given the outbreak in the US at least, we have to handle any input of US students or US visitors very carefully, because the US is the hot seat right now. This is the hot spot for the world. And we got to make sure we're not part of spreading a disease. So Can you ethically bring these people into your location, support your staff, your vendors, your families that you work with, the professors, the placements where you put them? Can you do that? Have you gone ahead and built a plan of how you will manage this that is knowable, that you can share with others? And how have you started negotiating with your insurance providers, the insurance providers you recommend to your participants, that COVID will in fact be a covered event? Evacuation, I think all insurances have been very clear on this. They're not going to evacuate for a pandemic, but does your insurance still protect the student if they come down sick with complications of COVID, that they will indeed get the medical treatment and care they deserve or they need? Backing up again, macro level of, should you and can you even go, of, all those concerns that are out there of, while you're waiting to see if a government's going to answer and say, oh, our visa offices are open again. Is that really the sole answer? When you look at a mitigation standpoint from this of, well, maybe you can't get a visa, 4-month visa, but maybe you don't need one because they're permitting visitors in for less than 90 days. Can you mitigate the risk to your programs or mitigate the ability to run by shortening your programs that fit within the current and existing laws? How much are you keyed into or tied into or informed about the on-arrival public health requirements? I mean, South Korea right now is very clean and very clear. All visitors that come in, there's a set protocol they have to follow. This is published, this is knowable, it's 14 days of quarantine. They have to download an app. They have to have their temperature taken 3 times a day. That app also does movement tracking. If they break the quarantine, they're immediately deported. And this is all known. Not everyone is as clean and clear as that one, but your government is actually is deciding and determining these things now, and you want to make sure you're paying attention to that. Should you or could you consider mandatory testing as a precondition for departing or a recommendation? And one of the things that's really gotten big here is these mandatory apps are having should you require a phone or a smartphone for people to travel with? South Korea requires that you have one, and that requires you download their app. But there are also apps on the phone for taking temperature, that participants can take their own temperature 3 times a day to ensure that they haven't gotten sick. The next bit you want to spend a little time right now is as part of trying to, any large problem, you start teasing it apart. And the big things are, all right, so if there is a fear of an outbreak or fear of a concern, how would you manage a need to depart differently? How would you support your participants in a way that can keep them safe if they have to leave? Or can you help them shelter in place until a wave passes? And what are your ethical considerations on this one? Certainly, there's been a lot of news in the US around the mandatory departure that was perceived, that was announced, and the immediate influx of all the people into the US is proven very likely to have spread the disease into certainly the East Coast in a vast and rapid and sudden way. So how can we ethically help our students and our interns travel better? The what else bits all tie into here sort of, basically what this means is you want to make sure that not only are you updating your emergency management plan so you are prepared, because preparedness is next to godliness in the risk management world, but are you training your staff fully and able to do that? Considerations on how you're continuing to monitor a change of conditions so you're not caught unexpected going, oh no, I didn't know it was coming. I didn't know that it was coming back. Certainly monitoring the news is one way, but are there news feeds and resources you can tie into that will help you with this one? One other consideration is sort of we've been talking around here is, we all used to spend a lot of time preparing our student, our intern for the experience that they're about to have. Thinking now we also need to prepare our students, our interns, for how to safely return to where they came from. How can they make sure they're part of managing a better COVID controlled world? And that means you plan for return. You don't just plan to go. The last 2 thoughts within this realm are about defining success. And I bring this up here is because on some levels there are costs to managing all of these things, and they're financial costs. And if you spend a moment or two to think about what your definition of success, what a successful program is, you might consider, you need to provide some value into what are the costs if you fail to be successful. How much will that hurt your brand, your reputation? um, assuming that a student gets it and recovers. But even the fact that they got it, how much of a problem is that? And what value do you want to put on being able to say we successfully and had a COVID-free experience, which may not be possible, but where do you want to define your values and how you define your success? Because it's not going to be what it was before. So it's something you want to spend some time on now as you start moving towards, all right, the specifics of the micro level operational concerns. So I'm going to turn it over to Colin to start drilling down even deeper once these bigger thoughts start sinking deep into you.
Thanks.
Colin.
Appreciate it. And you can just go to the next slide there. Well, I'll leave it for a second. Thanks, Bill. And thanks everyone for attending today. So hopefully the prior picture you saw with noodles on our heads doesn't become the new norm in our new COVID world. But as Bill Frederick and Bull have said here, we need to assume that COVID-19 is here to stay, possibly even with a vaccine. Even if effective treatments are developed and a vaccine is found to be effective, we could see this virus for many years to come. So as risk managers, we are looking at the long game here. And while we are hopeful that many of these things happen, we can't rely on them. We need to determine ways to mitigate risk wherever we can and determine if certain risks we can't mitigate are acceptable. So the following points are a few considerations to look at the micro level. Once we've cleared the hurdles of getting to our host country for an internship or study abroad, what things do we need to consider to best keep our interns safe at home, in public, and in the workplace? The first of these is testing. Are interns being tested before departure, at the airport, upon arrival? Basically, how will all this work? What is the availability of testing in the host country? And just to consider this, how effective is all this testing upon arrival? If the intern was just exposed at the airport, what does a negative test upon arrival really tell us? I don't think we have any tests that are so sensitive that they can pick up a positive case immediately after exposure. So to consider, will a 14-day quarantine be needed in any case? Second thing to consider is the logistics of any quarantine itself, especially if it's government mandated. Where will you house your interns and can they be in single rooms? How will you provide them food? And who is paying for all of this? Big question. Your organization or a provider organization, or will some or all of the costs be on the intern? And if you're controlling the intern's housing to some degree, what are your new policies to promote social distancing and mitigate the risk of the infection? Next slide, please. And here are some additional workplace considerations. When it comes to where the intern lives and works, what will be your advice or responsibilities for the intern to get to work? Should they be taking mass transportation or can they walk to work? Certainly most case studies now have shown us that the risk of infection outdoors and passing by people seems to be low, while the vast majority of outbreaks have been traced to indoor spaces and people in close proximity for an extended period of time. And what are the COVID-19 policies of the employer itself? How have you vetted this employer for your intern? Following the 3 A's we have listed below, assessing the risk, accepting certain risk, and then approving the internship in line with the Forum on Education Abroad's guidelines for internships, that would be our recommendation. Does the employer allow for staggered schedules with remote work on some days? Are masks required? And very importantly, how are you managing the expectations and responsibilities of both the employer and the intern? Next slide, please. And certainly worth reviewing would be the existing reporting protocols of both the employer and the intern in relationship to your organization. If the intern falls ill, or if there's a cluster outbreak near or in the business, how will your organization be notified? And after notification, what are the next steps? Further, when you have considered any limitations on independent travel of the intern or even work-related travel, have you considered all the limitations? Do you think it's best for the intern to remain in the city of their work for the duration, or will some type of travel be permitted? And if permitted, what risks of infection from the outside are you accepting? Finally, and we think this is extremely important here, as Bill had said earlier, what type of internship is this? Does it have some medical component to it? If so, should these types of internships be permitted? And what risks are you accepting as an organization and for the internships themselves? Next slide, please. And here are some just final other points to consider. Certainly this list we've discussed is not exhaustive, but are just some key points for consideration that in our minds. If your interns are congregating as a group at some point under your organization's control, what mitigation measures do you have in place for social distancing or dining? Does your organization or your intern both have a good understanding of their travel insurance? Are there any COVID-19 exclusions that have been recently created? And has the plan for the intern's return home been considered? Certainly, we need to consider the ethical obligations to ensure that interns return safely and they don't spread the disease in their home country's population, on their campus, or in their family. And just looping back to pre-departure, assuming that the CDC has possibly lowered their worldwide alert level to a level 2 in the future, that which will most likely advise travelers with medical conditions to be extremely careful. So does your organization have some type of medical review process so the intern knows the risks they face if they have a pre-existing conditions? And a final point on that, do you believe your intern is mature enough to follow all the guidelines set forth by the country and by your organization? And just a final point of consideration, and just something to think about in our COVID world, and dare I say it, maybe even in our post-COVID world, will the safety landscape have changed? Will crime have increased or decreased in the host country? Certainly with many out of work and struggling during COVID, the crime landscape could certainly change. And will the medical capacity be the same or increased, or has it been badly damaged by COVID for the foreseeable future? With that, I'll turn it back over to Bill Bull. Thank you.
Ready. Thank you, Colin, for that. As I start my video back up. So we just very briefly, in a very, very, very short period amount of time, threw a whole bunch of things at you, sort of getting an idea of what's going on in the world right now. The very simple concept we threw at you was, this is risk, and risk can be managed. It can't be eliminated, but you can mitigate it. You can reduce some things. Likely, perhaps you can. It depends on the specifics of the program you're running and the internships you're running. But even within that, there are still ways to mitigate or manage or minimize either the likelihood or the impact if a COVID event does occur. So we walk through that both on a macro level and then a few points getting down into the micro level of, I guess, what's the truism? Let no good crisis go wasted. Right now, you have a chance in a time with not having participants so much. You can really look into your protocols and your practices and your procedures, and in a way that you can start drilling down as to what you're going to do. Because as Bill pointed out at the very beginning, at the end of the day, we are looking at, well, we can't eliminate this risk, so we now have a shared risk. We need to outline in detail what are the limits and what are the details of what risks we are sharing, what are the expectations in sharing that risk. So at the end of the day, we end up with the legal concept of informed consent, that the participants who come onto the program have acknowledged and agreed with what is happening, what the mitigations are, what their responsibilities are, what are the limits of your work and the limits of your ability to mitigate, and what risks they are taking on themselves and responsibilities to manage themselves in this world. All that collectively becomes informed consent. So when they walk through the door, everyone knows what their roles are and what to do. And that gets back to, on some levels, the need for communication is greater than ever, and your ability to articulate how you will support them will go a long way into making this happen. Again, once some of the larger levels, things which we can't mitigate. We can't mitigate a level 4 travel ban. What we can mitigate is on-arrival procedures and care while they're there. So we'll end with that and open up for questions. And I will mute myself and let Matt and Allison go through this. We want to give a little bit of time to answer the few questions that we can. And thank you all for your attention. It's been great.
Well, thank you, panel. You've given us a lot to consider. I know there's been some questions come in. So Allison, if you're available, if you could ask some of the questions. Thank you.
I'm here. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great.
Bill's still muted
Okay.
though.
Gotcha.
Okay. Can you provide examples that would be helpful to have on a phone when it comes to helping students in managing COVID-19? Examples of apps, if they exist yet.
I don't have them memorized off the top of my head. If you go to your app store and look at thermometer. Right now, you can actually download personal thermometers and each student will be able to. There's a few that are higher rated than others, but I don't know their names precisely. There's a few location trackers that are out there, and I don't have the site for the South Korean government. Other governments are developing their own for managing the students for tracking and control. But so I guess the answer is I can't give you a specific one just yet.
One of
Okay.
the main things, I've been seeing quite a few stories out there, just even within Europe, the different apps being developed, they're having difficulty having them even talk to each other. And I know Google and Apple are trying to work together. So that's, we're running into technology snags as well.
Okay. Thank you. What news sources do you recommend to get information?
So there's all the traditional ones, and I'm waiting to see if the State Department and the CDC will develop some new pieces. But there's a whole bunch of sites out there that are doing excellent data aggregation that you can look at. And the one that, of course, everybody's been looking at is the Johns Hopkins heat map, so you can figure out on a day-to-day basis what the caseloads are everywhere. And if I was trying to be strategic about what countries to go to or monitoring a particular country, that's certainly one of the ones that I would be looking at. But there are some that we've all been looking at recently. The Domo coronavirus tracker is a great one that quantifies a lot of the information and also does projections for future operations. I like looking at the Air Transport Association for country-specific protocols. What the borders are, what the flight availability is, what the quarantine policies, et cetera. A lot of that is on those sites. If you're looking for, does the country have the infrastructure to manage the pandemic? The Global Health Index is a great site to look at. There's a gazillion sites out there. More seem to be popping up every day. Bill's got gazillions of them. And it's really more like most information acquisition. It's very much about choosing which ones to spend your time on or organizing it in a panel so that you're not spending all day just surfing the net, so that you can look at something pretty quick and get the information that you need.
We've gone ahead and taken our sources, most of the ones that Bill just mentioned, along with the IHME is another one that does projections certainly around capacity in hospital beds and those sorts of stuff. And Worldometers is out there. And we've built we do a Monday check-in every Monday of what everyone's status is. And we're comparing week to week to week, because certainly we see it around the US and other places. There is a belief of you want to see a downward trend or a better control trend over time. And the problem right now is there's a giant amount of information, and discernment is the issue. So pick a time, measure it every Monday for your locations of where you're at, what the presence is, and start tracking that, so you can say with authority, we had X amount here, we have Y amount now, and the trend keeps going down and getting better and better and better. And we've been doing that now. We actually, I don't know, we're working on posting it on our website. We've been doing it for a select number of sites. So that is available out there. We share it with some of our partners. Colin, any other website you are particularly fond of? We keep looking, and cross-reference is always the thing. No one website seems to have it all.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, and Worldometer, Johns Hopkins have been seemingly the most reliable for right now, even though there's all kinds of speculation out there as far as, the accuracy of these numbers and how. I'd like to Bill Frederick's comparison again. It's apples and hammers sometimes with these countries. So, and it's even within the United States from state to state. So I think we've listed most of them there.
Okay, great. Thank you. There were some clarifying questions in the chat box, so Patrick is putting links in there for folks. And then a couple more questions. What can university career service centers do to help industry partners to move forward with internships?
So I'll jump first on that one. So one of the, Colin went on, I'm pretty big on this one, which is the university career centers, that sort of stuff, could play a strong role in connecting both the intern and the employer together about COVID management practices at the internship site. What is the company doing? What aren't they doing? What are their expectations? How are they training their teams? How are they training their staff? Because the last thing we want is a disparity between what a intern believes is the right thing to do. You know, we might have a kid saying, well, I can just tell it's only a cold. I'm going to go to work and show I'm dedicated, and only arrive there and have everyone appalled that they showed up even though it was just a cold. They can say, well, I did my temperature. I don't have a temperature. I'm good to come to work. They really need to get down into the detail of brass tacks of, you know, we didn't talk too much around it about from the risk side of the house, but one of the outcomes of not being able to measure and assess risk is an increased fear factor. I mean, that's what we've been seeing. The panic we all felt, the fear we all feel is, you know, we don't know. I mean, from a straight up risk management standpoint, the, you know, travel related injuries and deaths and car accidents, you know, they're terrible. They're awful. They're all over the world. We know all these things are there, but we know it, we understand it, and therefore we accept it. We're not quite there yet with risk, with COVID-19. So to the extent that universities can make sure that how each company wants the student prepared, how each student has connected to whoever is onboarding them in a way that they can feel safe and supported, will be extremely valuable for all sides. Let's not skip that piece. It's a huge piece.
Okay, thank you. Next question. What are your recommendations for best practices in student housing? Single rooms for all participants, or simply ensuring an additional room or rooms will be available in the event a student needs to be quarantined?
So if I had unlimited money, this is pretty simple. We've been spending a lot of time with this. Single rooms where a student can self-isolate is the preferred. It's just there. I mean, they can be limit their exposure to other people. If there's an outbreak, that they can go in and they can huddle up there and they can do virtual work from that environment. They can feed themselves and care for themselves inside that single space. You know, the mitigation is, you know, well, if you can't do that, well, if you're going to do a double, you have to do a double for whatever reason. Well, can it be 2 single rooms in a shared apartment? Okay, that's better than. I would avoid mass congregate housing and sit there and say a quad with 2 bunk beds and 4 people sharing a room is kind of a bad plan at this moment. And this is where we're back to sort of what are the costs of success and what do you value for success of. Now is the time to invest in, perhaps spend a little more on housing to make sure that if something goes wrong, you're prepared and you're ready, you've mitigated. And then at the event that you do that with signals as best as possible. If you have to go for a double, get as big a room as you can, put a curtain between the beds. Talk to the students about sleeping head to toe and toe to head. Talk to the students themselves about ethics, about how to be responsible for each other's wellness, about cleanliness and cleaning the bathrooms, cleaning the kitchens and the shared surfaces. I mean, we could be collective on this about how we work together. But again, if money was no object, everyone would have a single. Colin, Bill, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of pieces in there, like whether that sort of go around that, not just in the housing itself, but whether or not you're going to have people quarantined before they all move into housing together. Are you going to limit people's interaction once they're in country to a certain area? There's a number of risk reduction practices that you may or may not employ, depending on where you're going, what you're doing, what the nature of the internship is. Et cetera. But certainly just on, you know, single rooms versus double, triples, quadruples. Yeah, single room would be ideal if you can swing it. Homestays, I think if you do have people staying in homestays, you need to vet the family pretty well and figure out, are their family members working in a medical environment? Are they working in a grocery store? Are they, you know, highly exposed, et cetera? A lot of pieces in there.
Okay, thank you. We're going to do one last question. Does health, safety, and security operate differently for underrepresented and marginalized students? How can we support those students who have these very real concerns?
Does health, safety, and security operate differently for underrepresented students. It does to the extent that there are additional concerns, that there are different, sometimes depending upon the population, there might be additional exposures that one has to be paying attention to. From a COVID standpoint, though, just from a disease understanding, yes, there's certainly way too much data that shows that it is disproportionately impacting people of color in the US, but it's pretty clear that that is not because they are of color, that's because of all the socioeconomic factors that go around that. So I would posit that if the same standards we apply for every student, for any student we apply for those students, will be effective. Conversations should be had around, you know, the different risk exposures, essentially, of going out in public and being in different work environments are a concern. I don't know, Bill, Colin?
The only thing I'm thinking of is, I mean, certainly there are some medical conditions that are diabetes, high blood pressure, et cetera, that are going to make people more susceptible to COVID-19, but it's not so much population, it's more health issues.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank the panel. You guys have provided so much content and so many things to consider as we try to move our students around the globe in a safe and thoughtful way. So thank you once again to all our panelists. And thank you for attending today's session. You clearly have shown an interest and a passion for learning more to help your students navigate this atmosphere that we find ourselves in. I just wanted to further say one thing about the Global Internship Conference. Just have a look out in the next little while for some communications about how we're opening up the GIC for you to play a bigger role in that. And we're also revamping our website. And I'm hoping to have further sessions in the future. I think what today and yesterday's sessions show is that there is so much to learn and to adapt to with our challenges today that, you know, quite frankly, this session could have gone at least an hour longer. And I think there will be an opportunity in the next 4 to 6 weeks to update where we're at and see how we can further learn how to navigate in a safe and mindful way. So once again, I want to thank our panel, Bill, Frederick, and Colin McElroy. Thank you so much for your input. And also I want to thank Allison and Patrick for being, you know, the kind of the spine on the back end of this broadcast. As I mentioned, we have recorded this broadcast and we will be posting it to our website as soon as we can. So if you didn't see the whole thing or want to come back to it, you're certainly welcome to share that information as well. So I'm going to end it there and wish everyone a safe and happy day. And I don't know if our panel wants to say anything in parting, but I'll just leave it up to you guys.
Wish we could have gone much longer, but thank you for what you gave us.
And also, their email addresses are come up there, and people have asked for a link to the presentation, and we'll try to get that up as well so that you can review many of the slides. So once again, thank you all and have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you all.